Good morning, good day, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to this year's first episode of Trade Winds. My name is Cecilia Malmström. I'm a non-resident senior fellow at Peterson Institute for International Economics. We have a very exciting subject today, subsidies, and we have a very exciting panel. I am thrilled and honored to welcome no less than 4 very qualified speakers that are joining us from different corners of the world today. I'm honored to welcome Ignacio Garcia Bercero, who is Director for Multilateral Affairs at DG Trade in the Commission in Brussels, and also visiting professor at University College of London. We have Professor Simon Evenett, who is Professor of Economics at University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. We have Professor Julia Ya Qin, who is Professor of Law at Wayne State University. And we have my colleague from Peterson, Mr. Chad Bown, Reginald Jones, Senior Fellow at Peterson. Thank you all for joining, and thank you, all of you who are joining us online. So we will talk about subsidies. Globally, there are a lot of subsidies, and they seem to be growing. With the pandemic, of course, many countries have invested in their industries and issued lots of subsidies. And some of them are, of course, useful for domestic reasons and can be motivated from a recovery perspective. But some are causing international damage on global competition and trade. And this is a phenomenon that we also saw before the pandemic. So we will try to sort out today, with the help of our experts, which subsidies are harmful, which are not, how do we deal with them, what can WTO do? But first, what is a subsidy? Well, very briefly, and I'm sure the panelists will come back to that, a subsidy is a financial contribution by governments or a public body that offer benefits to individuals and firms. They can be direct payments, they can be tax cuts, they can be rebates, they can be in form of production subsidy, an export or import subsidy, consumer subsidy, tax subsidy, transport subsidy. So there are many of them, and they all seek to selectively provide a financial benefit to a producer, a consumer, or a user of a particular goods and service. And some of them are good and reasonable, but some of them are, of course, damaging, both to domestic but also international competition. And how do we deal and how do we weigh the benefits against the distorting effects? I thought I would ask Professor Simon Evenett to help us out on this. You are also the creator and the founder of Global Trade Alert. You have tried to map with your team global subsidies in your last report from 2008 till today. So let's start with this, Simon. Tell us about the report. What are we looking at? What is the tendency? Over to you.
Thanks, Cecilia, for introducing the subject. You know, for such a high-profile trade policy subject like subsidies, we know remarkably little about the resort to subsidies and the global reach of subsidies. And what we tried to do in the 28th Global Trade Alert report was to go some way to remedy that by looking in detail at the subsidies of China, the European Union, and the United States since, as you said, the start of the global financial crisis. We took a very classic definition of what a subsidy is. We also looked at national sources of information for subsidies, not looking at WTO notifications, which sadly have become contested. Building on those national sources, we were able to document over 18,000 different corporate subsidies. And we're not interested in subsidies to individuals' welfare state payments, not interested in subsidies to different levels of government or foreign aid. That, for us, was off the table. What we're interested in is payments to firms engaged in commercial activity. And they could be state-linked firms as well, which, of course, is important in some jurisdictions, more in some than others. Now, what did we find? Well, the first thing we found is that when you look across the 3 big jurisdictions, there's very uneven levels of transparency about subsidies. The United States and China do not have centralized inventories of subsidies. And if you go to the subnational level, both jurisdictions have considerable problems with transparency of their local subsidies. If you look at the European Union and China, both have state development banks, which are very active. and not always necessarily particularly transparent. And even in the case of the EU, which has its own state aid regime, that is good insofar as it goes. There are lots of subsidies in the EU which fall outside the state aid regime, which are not necessarily as well documented. So the first big point is that no one is holier than thou when it comes to transparency. Everyone has there's room for improvement everywhere. The second big finding is that we found for each of the three jurisdictions, there's over 5,000 subsidy awards each that we could document. In total, we documented over 18,000. And almost all, about 99% of them, are subsidy awards or increases. So the direction of travel is towards more and more subsidization. And so as a result, subsidies are not a feature, corporate subsidies are not a feature of any one development model. The third big finding is that the scale of the amount of goods trade potentially affected or covered by corporate subsidies is actually quite significant. Using very fine-grained trade data, in fact, the finest grade trade data that's available globally, we estimate that 62% of global goods trade is covered by a subsidy that's issued by the EU, the US, or China. And that's before the pandemic hit. So you can put the pandemic subsidies on top of that, right? And in fact, one of the important findings on our work is that if you took away the global financial crisis and the pandemic, you'd still have about 12,000 subsidies undertaken by these three jurisdictions. So subsidies are corporate subsidies are used during normal times. It's not just a crisis response, and the scale of them is pretty significant. Now, what we do in our report is to scope out the potential scale of this jurisdiction by jurisdiction and together. We don't get into what are the estimating the effects. That's a very important matter which some people have worked on, and it's an important area where we need to make further progress. And that's really important for then going to the policy implications of our work. We think it doesn't make much sense to focus trade policy discussions on subsidies on any one development model or on any one sector like agriculture or on any one type or narrow set of subsidies. I think a broader perspective is probably needed. Otherwise, it's quite likely that at least one big player is going to feel that they're under more scrutiny than others, and they won't have much incentive to come to the table. And that might be one of the lessons that we also learned from the Trilateral initiative. Now, in terms of organizing a progress in the area of subsidies or taking that subject forward, I don't get a strong sense that there's an interest in Geneva in a fully fledged negotiation on new subsidy rules. But what is interesting are the signals that enough different interested individuals and countries want to talk about where the boundaries of a negotiation could be. So there's a desire for an informal policy dialogue to sketch out what a possible negotiation could be. And here, with that in mind, maybe I could just finish by saying, look, maybe we should organize that discussion around two really high-profile imperatives that we have these days. One, how to build back better. Can we build back better and recover from the pandemic without issuing so many subsidies that we heavily distort the global trading system? And secondly, of course, is the transition to a low-carbon economy. And we don't want to save the environment and sacrifice the trading system at the same time. Ideally, we'd like to be able to tackle the former without ruining the latter. And I think if we took both of those themes, we could ask questions about where are subsidies really needed? Do we need a necessity test for subsidies? When is a subsidy really needed? Or should some other policy be used? How can subsidies be designed in ways that create the least cross-border harm, given that there are so many different types of subsidies? And since often the case for subsidies is very temporary, what subsidies do we need to get us out of the pandemic? What subsidies do we need to get to the transition to a low carbon economy? What are the mechanisms we can put in place which will help phase out subsidies when they've done their job so they don't get locked in? So I think these are the types of bigger picture questions which we could usefully reflect upon going forward. I do want to say one last thing, which is that I think as a result of our study, the burden of proof is really on anyone who doesn't think that their jurisdiction isn't creating many cross-border spillovers with subsidies. The amount of subsidies that we found are so many and so extensive. We're not saying we found them every subsidy, but we found enough that I think the burden of proof is on people who think that if any one jurisdiction is responsible, then they need to show that, because our work shows that the world, or at least the big players, have a subsidy problem, and we really need to start addressing it. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Simon. It's a really impressive work that you and your team have done in mapping all these more than 18,000 subsidies, and growing, as I understand it, even if you disregard the COVID effect of this. You said that they were in so many different areas. Could you just, for the sake of the audience, what kind of subsidies are we talking about? Is it agriculture or energy, technology?
So you can see subsidy, if you look across the sectors, we have, of course, the traditional subsidies in agriculture. We found about 12,000 subsidies in manufacturing. We also found 4,500 subsidies to service sector firms. Very few of them are financial firms, by the way. So we're not just talking bailouts of banks and things like this. So across the sectors, there's many of them. And then, as you noted in your opening remarks, there are so many different types of subsidies as well that you really have to keep an eye on all of them, not just focus on one or two types.
This is really interesting. We'll come back to the questions you asked at the end here as well. Chad, as a consequence of all these subsidies emerging, there has, of course, been subsidy-related disputes, trade disputes, that has increased as well. And the EU and Japan have criticized China for subsidies, but as we see that quite evenly spread the subsidies as well. There are rules on this in the WTO. If a country considers that a subsidy is harmful, you could go to the WTO, and there's old regulations there, and there are definitions which seem to be a little bit outdated and not really capture the needs of today. And one way to deal with harmful subsidies has been to use countervailing measures, and the countervailing measure is, to put it shortly, an increased duty to offset subsidies given to producers or exporters in the exporting country. And you just published yesterday morning, I think, a paper on this, where you try also to map out how the subsidy-related disputes have increased, and the countervailing measures, and what to do, particularly in the context of W. Would you be so kind to present that report to us in summary? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Let me share or attempt to share my screen here. Okay, I'm assuming you can see it okay. So thank you for the invitation to be with you. I'm going to follow up on what Simon described. He laid out the data and the framework for the way of thinking about subsidies. He also brought up this point of policymakers in Geneva and elsewhere around the world maybe not wanting to have a broader discussion about new subsidy rules. We'll see. What I'm going to make the case for is that we probably need to broaden the conversation, because this issue of subsidies is permeating everywhere, and especially it's part of what's holding up having even binding dispute settlement at the WTO altogether. And I'm going to show that through some data. And so everybody is familiar with the Trump administration's decision to end the appellate body, so we don't have our old system of dispute settlement anymore. And my argument is essentially going to be that we need to figure out new rules or acceptable permissible use of trade remedies. So that includes countervailing measures to address subsidy concerns in order to fix it. And without that, and without then some broader understanding of subsidies disciplines, that's probably unlikely to happen. So briefly, let me I'm going to show you 5 or 6 slides to make the point here using some data. And so what we've seen over the last few years is certainly an increase in the trade coverage. So this is kind of the share of major economies' imports that are being subjected to trade remedies. So these is anti-subsidy measures like CVDs, countervailing duties, anti-dumping, and safeguards. And the other point I'm going to make is, for lots of purposes, these policies are incredibly interchangeable. So lawyers like to think that, countervailing duties, that's how we deal with subsidies. Well, in reality, governments do lots of different things to deal with troublesome imports, whether they're subsidized or not. And so it's really hard to disentangle these things. What we've seen is an increase in these things over time. But another feature of the data is when you look at who the exporters are that are getting hit by these things, it's obviously increasingly China's exporters. And so, by the end of 2019, and so this is also pre-pandemic, we're going to see probably a sharp increase in trade remedy use with the pandemic and the subsidies associated with that. You had 7% of China's exports, both to rich countries, this is the G20 rich countries, but also G20 emerging markets that are now sitting under these trade remedies. And again, this is governments doing lots of different policy instruments. So the United States focusing on just the trade remedy use against China, it's a combination of instruments. 10% of China's imports or exports to the US are sitting under anti-dumping, 8% are sitting under countervail, so anti-subsidy, and another 1% are sitting under safeguards. Canada's similar numbers. Other economies, may be more likely to focus exclusively on anti-dumping. India, Turkey, for example, roughly 20% of their imports from China sitting under anti-dumping. Indonesia likes to use safeguards, right? So the issue for all of these countries is the concern about imports from China. Legally, they're not sure why they're concerned about them. One of them is arguably the economic model, but the legal precision is not there to help us out yet. But that being said, this isn't just the US, Europe versus China type of issue that one might originally think when thinking about this. Third country exporters, whether or not you're subsidizing or not, are increasingly being caught up in the trade remedies, so oftentimes tariffs, that are being applied to deal with troublesome imports from China. And so that's the growing pink area in each of these charts. So, right, you think about an example of this under the Trump administration, steel and aluminum, the main story there was concern about imports from China. The United States had long ago stopped those from coming in directly through anti-dumping and countervail. But they use those national security tariffs to stop the imports from coming in from everybody else because they're essentially, homogeneous products and it doesn't matter who's producing them. Even if you're not subsidizing, you can get caught up in these things. And that's what increasingly we're seeing. Second to last slide, this was the argument that the Trump administration was making that WTO dispute settlement works well in general, but it tended to disproportionately target US use of trade remedies. So anti-dumping, countervailing duties, safeguards that the United States had applied were all highly targeted by other countries through WTO dispute settlement, much less so in other countries, even though we have some other countries that are using trade remedies equally or even perhaps more than the United States. And the United States, heading into the Uruguay round, or as a result of the Uruguay round, had thought it negotiated policy space, to use buzzwords, to be able to use some of these trade remedies. And the feeling was that the appellate body in particular took that away. And so this was, the main US argument. And this is not only in a Trump administration argument. This is kind of a long-standing argument that came out the Bush administration, Obama administration, and has not been refuted certainly by the Biden administration either. So hopefully our legal experts will tell us about some of the ideas of how we might address these in terms of new rules. I see there's basically three broad buckets. One is attempting to write more legal precision to try to write harmful subsidies out of existence. I think that's going to be really hard. There are suggestions to maybe focus on the economic effects. So looking at competitive neutrality, especially for state-owned enterprises, of which China is well known. But a third approach is to say, well, maybe trying to write increasingly disciplined rules on subsidies, notifying them, maybe that's the wrong approach because it's just too hard. Maybe we should be focusing instead on the market access implication of subsidies and what we're really worried about under the WTO and trading system, which is market access. Last slide, and then I'll stop. If we don't do anything, is it likely that trade remedy use against certain exporters like China might go away on its own? Well, it sort of happened with respect to South Korea and Japan, which were the main targets of anti-dumping in the 1980s and early 1990s. There's been less targeting of them over time, but I think there's no signs yet that things are going to let up anytime soon with respect to China, so I don't think we should necessarily hold our breath. With that, I'll stop. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. Can we take away the slides? Yes, thank you. So I can see you again. Thank you so much for this. This is indeed increasing, and it fits very well into what Simon said. So we do need some more legal precision on what a subsidy is and which ones are harmful and how you define that. And I mean, there is a framework in the WTO on defining both harmful subsidies and actionable subsidies, but also on the countervailing measures. But you think they are, I think you say that somewhere in your paper, they are a bit obsolete. So you would really need to revise them. But on the other hand, it might be more of a market access problem. Do you think you can do both? Can we start a process? We have already started that at the Trilateral. I'll come back to that when we talk with Ignacio, but to see if we can work from the existing WTO rules and make them much more precise.
Well, I think that's the natural inclination of Americans, Europeans, and Japanese and lawyers to try to write more legal precision about things.
Indeed.
I don't think that's the natural inclination of economists. But I also think once you would get China to the table, it would become increasingly challenging to try to imagine from their perspective and write down all of the rules that would capture everything that one might be worried about. And so my concern is that this could be just an incredibly onerous and impossible to achieve task at the end of the day. And so you might want to step back and say, what is it that we're really worried about? And then focus on addressing those, some of the spillovers, I think that Simon talked about, and trying to design rules that really target what it is that we're worried about in the spillovers.
Yes, exactly.
Good luck, lawyers.
Because exactly, we need to pay the lawyers for many years, but this is also a policy issue as well, and we need a lot of researchers here. Julia, you have written a lot about this as well. There's a lot of blaming on China, but as we have seen, I mean, both the EU and US, and as also Chad shown, Canada and others also have subsidies and countervailing measures. And so China is very often mentioned as the biggest sinner here, but is definitely not alone. Could you tell us a little bit about what is the precise challenge with the Chinese subsidies, and what could be long-term, short-term solutions to this, in your view?
Well, thank you, Cecilia. This is a very exciting conversation here. So thank you for inviting me to the conversation here. As both Simon's and Chad's comments and their work is very inspiring. And the questions both of them just raised is, especially Chad in the end is saying, we better identify what exactly you want for global regulations, shall we say, or global some kind of regime to regulate the subsidies by governments. So the first thing, as in my further research, I found that there are two inconsistent or conflicting theories behind what is the purpose of regulating globally subsidies. One is the efficiency. We wanted to achieve global level efficiency. So subsidies sometimes are promoting correct market failures, and then that's good. But then if it's inefficient on a global basis, then that should be regulated. On the other hand, if you look at the WTO rules, it's all harm-based, and it's especially focused on importing countries' domestic industry perspective, whether they are being harmed by subsidized imports. So these two things, if you notice, actually the ESM, the subsidy agreement of the WTO, does not have a preamble. It does not say what this agreement is supposed to achieve. And my understanding is because the negotiators couldn't agree on what we're regulating subsidies for. What is that globally achieve efficiency, or it's just protect the particular competing industries, especially in the importing country. Although the WTO rules have provided possibility of bringing subsidies to the dispute settlement to address the adverse effect of subsidies on the global, on the world market. Nonetheless, it's much more difficult to achieve than the traditional countervailing measures as Chad just described. So as Now, about China, what's so unique about the subsidies in China as compared to the more traditional market economies? I think the difference is critical, and I would characterize that difference as state control versus state intervention. So in the traditional market economies, government use subsidies to so-called intervene in the market. And the purpose of that intervention can be very diverse, ranging from industrial policy, national security, redistribution of wealth, correcting market failure, et cetera, et cetera. But in modern history, the relationship between the government and the market changes like pendulum swings. Currently, the government role is apparently on the rise. But no matter how big the government role grows, it's never the objective of the government to control the market. In contrast, the government in China, this has, of course, the historical background of central planned economy. The government in China seeks control today, still, over the market. In order to have that control, the government maintains a large state sector that dominates key industries from resources, upstream resource industries to finance. And as for the private sector, the Chinese government has never truly trusted it and will not allow private firms to grow too big and too powerful. A recent crackdowns of China's high-tech, successful high-tech firms are a prime example. And also the government can decide just kill off the entire industry overnight, as it did recently to the private tutoring industry. Overnight, 60,000 employees from one firm fired, private firm, because they have no business anymore. Government just decided to get rid of it. So in the China context, subsidies is just one of the tools for government to use to maintain state control, depending on what the government decides is the right policy. So the mentality is very different. But how would that difference between state intervention and the state control impact the global regime on subsidy regulation? And the key thing is it will impact the identification, definition of a subsidy, and identifying the subsidy and calculating the subsidy and think about how to remedy it. The whole thing comes down to how can you identify what the subsidy is. So in theory, when the government maintains a complete control over economic activities in the society, there can be no meaningful concept of a government subsidies, since the government is the economy. That's why before 2006, the United States did not apply countervailing duties against Chinese imports, because China at the time was still classified as a non-market economy under US law. Now, after decades of economic liberalization, China now is reversing the course and tightening state control over all economic actors and over the market. So if this trend continues, at some point, theoretically, China can become almost a non-market economy again. At that point, of course, the meaning of government subsidy will be lost again. But we're not there yet. So the current situation is like we have a very extensive role of the government, overwhelming role of the government in the Chinese economy, but that economy is deeply intertwined with the rest of the world. So how we cope with that situation? But there are some remedies are available still to cope with the situation under the existing WTO system. What Chad pointed out is true that the WTO dispute settlement system has been crippled, but we still have existing tools that can manage. Again, it depends on what your goal is, and to curb the harm of the competing domestic industries in an importing country, or somehow to curb the harm against other competing industries on the world market. It's a complex situation. But the one powerful tool, as Chad pointed out, is the countervailing measures. And it's available only to importing countries against imports. So if it's the Chinese, the imports subsidized, if you can identify the harm, then that is a very effective tool, I would say. And today there have been a total of 193 countervailing duty measures reported as of June 30th last year at the WTO. There are 193 countervailing duties measures against China as of throughout the entire history as of the end of last June. And the United States took 103 out of the 193. So far, the Chinese government has only challenged 5 out of that 193 countervailing measures initiated at the WTO, only brought WTO disputes against 5 of them. 4 out of 5 were against the United States, 1 against Australia. So the United States, China generally has this policy not to bring WTO disputes against developing countries, possibly avoid against EU, possibly against everybody except the United States. That's just essentially the policy of the Chinese government in terms of the WTO disputes. So what it means is, if importing country believes its industry are harmed by subsidized Chinese imports, it can effectively restrict that imports by raising the prices through the countervailing duties. Am I over my time? Sorry, am I talking too long? Okay. So that is one method. Of course, China has been using countervailing duty measures also against other countries using the unilateral measures domestically. This is all permitted under WTO rules. And the other tool available is to take subsidy disputes to the WTO dispute settlement. But as Chad pointed out, right now, the appellate body has been disrupted by the Trump administration. Is the system still working? The answer is actually yes. There are actually 2 ways to take the disputes, subsidy disputes to the WTO multilaterally to address the problems. One is if the parties can accept the panel decision as final without appeal. Historically, throughout the history of the WTO, about 1/3 of disputes that reached the panel level have been accepted by parties at the panel level without appeal. That's 1/3 of it. It's not too much, but nonetheless significant. And the important thing to keep in mind is actually China has often accepted panel reports as the final without appeal. So it's not impossible. And then the other one is the more recent, since 2020, the EU took the initiative. Now there is a temporary fix for the appeal system. So more than 20 countries, more than 20 members, EU, China, Canada, Australia, Mexico, Brazil, New Zealand, bunch of others, more than 20 members accepted a temporary mechanism. It's called MPIIE. The full name is like a multi-party appeal mechanism of some sort. I forgot the exact name of it. But the gist of it is to use arbitration provision in the WTO agreement. Originally, it was designed for complete alternative to the panel AB system. But now that arbitration system has been adapted to establish a appeal arbitration. In other words, the panel decision can be appealed to that arbitration panel. And these more than 20 members agreed they're going to accept the arbitration panel as the final decision if there is appeal. And so most recently, China has agreed with Canada and Australia in their recent 3 disputes. 2 of them involve China's countervailing measures, actually, to appeal. If there is appeal from the panel, they will go to the MPIIE system. So there is a temporary fix, and the problem is the United States is the largest user of countervailing measures, does not like the system and never joined it, and Japan, Korea have not joined it. So I'm saying there are still systems of at the WTO available to address it, but ultimately the problem is at this point is, especially with regard to China, the point is we have difficulties in dealing with identifying what is or is not government action in China that has the effect of subsidies. Right? The current definition of subsidy of the WTO does not apply to China very well. There are 2 sides of it. On the one hand, it does not capture many government actions that have the effect of subsidizing firms in China, because government can simply direct firms to do or not to do something without having to transfer state resource. And of course, another is a huge problem over whether Chinese SOEs should be categorized as public body. And then the appellate body jurisprudence is not super clear and got a lot of criticism, especially from the United States. So in that sense, the definition of subsidy can be very under inclusive when applied to China. But on the other hand, the definition of subsidy can also lead to denial of China's true comparative advantage. That is because under the WTO subsidy agreement, whether a subsidy exists or not depends on a benchmark, whether the government contribution confers a benefit. That benefit is identified by comparing to market benchmark, what is the commercial reality. Because the government plays such a dominant role in the Chinese market, WTO law now allows other members to discard Chinese domestic market conditions. In other words, to use external benchmark, either the world market or third market prices, as the benchmark to determine whether there is or is not a benefit incurred in China. So that actually can end up denying whatever the true advantage, comparative advantage China has in a particular product in the industry. So applying the existing rules in the China context is very problematic. And so we'd like to get a result that is at once over-conclusive and under-inclusive. So that is an ultimate difficulty applying existing rules to a statist economy. So I stop there.
Thank you very much for that perspective. So there are, of course, means and tools in the WTO, as we all discussed, but they are a bit outdated and with a massive amount of subsidies coming independently on how you define them. And this is, of course, my subsidy can be very harmful for you, but I think it's useful. If we embark on a WTO reform process on this, would China engage in that, or would they still see that the existing tools would be sufficient for the time being?
I would think that the Chinese right now just think, okay, of course, the geopolitical, geoeconomic situation is such there is practically no, in the foreseeable future, no prospect for China agreeing with the West on these on any of these subsidy rules, I would say. So practically speaking, I think going forward, we might think about the plurilateral model of the Tokyo subsidy code of 79. So from then, from 79, you had the plurilateral, some selected, mostly developed economies within the GATT at the time agreed to a advanced subsidy code to regulate government subsidies, which then became the basis for developing the current WTO subsidies years later. And so at this point, politically, it's not feasible to agree almost on anything, let alone a sensitive subject that touches the nerves of the government. So I think that the practical way of going forward is first, like Chad pointed out, identify what each government really wants out of the global regulation, and then take the similarly minded people together and maybe agree on a set of rules applied to plurilaterally within the WTO world, and then hopefully in the future things will change. That move towards more of a multilateral agreement in the end. But there's a lot of work to do before then.
Indeed. Thank you very much for that. And welcome back, Ignacio. I saw that you have some technical problems. Maybe you missed part of the interesting things that Julia said. But of course, some attempts, talking about plurilateral, trying to amend this, there has been. And you and I were in Buenos Aires 4 years ago, together with the then USTR Ambassador Lighthizer and the then minister from Japan, Minister Kino. And we we started to SECO, and we started to discuss whether it was possible to amend WTO rules and start identifying various areas, subsidies, and many areas. And there were actually some progress there on trying to be more precise in defining subsidies. And I know that the European Union is continuing this work with the new administration, but also that the Commission has presented proposals on how to deal with the lack of playing field when it comes to subsidies as well. So it would be very interesting to get the European Union's view on these issues as well. So Ignacio, over to you.
No, thank you very much, Cecilia, and I'm really sorry I had to miss the last part of Julia's presentation. There was some technical hiccup. Now, what I would like to do in my presentation is just to give some views about possible options that could be followed to respond in the WTO to the challenges raised by subsidies. But before doing so, perhaps 3 comments. First, as you have quite rightly said, there was an important work that was developed in the trilateral context to try to imagine how the rules of the WTO could be strengthened. And there was in the January of 2020, a joint trilateral statement summarizing the state of play of our discussions with some specific ideas about how the rules of subsidies in the WTO could be reinforced. Now, then the pandemic came, then there was a change of administration in the United States, and for quite some time there was no longer trilateral discussions. Very recently has been decided to relaunch this exercise. I'm not really going to talk on behalf of the trilateral because I don't really have the capacity to do it, and because we have only really started to discuss these issues back again. But what I would like to say is first 2 comments about the nature of the problem, and then 3 possible options to respond to the problem. Now, I don't think there's any question that we are talking about something which is extremely significant in terms of its impact on the global trading system. And for us, there's no doubt that if we fail to act, if we fail to find the response, the risk is that we are going to see an increased degree of trade tensions. Subsidies are going to increase in the context of the post-pandemic, in the context of Build Back Better, in the context of the transition towards a carbon neutral economy. There is no question that there's going to be an increase on subsidies in most jurisdictions. Subsidies sometimes have been provided for very legitimate reasons. I think there can be no question about that, but they also have negative spillover effects, which come to the question, which are the spillover effects which can be problematic from the point of view of the global trading system. There are basically 3 types of spillover effects. There can be cases in which subsidies nullify market access commitments in the country which has adopted the subsidy, that the market access impacts. There's cases in which subsidies distort competition in certain country markets. The importing country has the capacity to react, and that's where trade defense comes into place. But there's also concerns about distortions of competition in certain country markets. So from the point of view of the spillover effects, those are basically the 3 issues that have always been the concerns from the global trading system. Now, we had an interesting discussion about lawyers and economists. Now, I find it very difficult to imagine how you can respond to those challenges without looking into rules. Because quite frankly, the alternative to rules is managed trade. And rules are sometimes difficult to negotiate. Sometimes they take time, sometimes they are challenging, but managed trade does not solve the problems. And I think that you have seen about how the US tried to solve its problems with China through a managed trade approach. It hasn't been particularly impressive. Now, in terms about what it is that can be done, I mean, I think that there's basically 3 options, which are not necessarily mutually exclusive, which can also be sequenced in time because they have clearly quite significantly different levels of ambition. The best solution from the European Union perspective would be to negotiate what we call a plurilateral agreement on competitive neutrality. This would go beyond subsidies, because I think, as Julia has said very clearly, if you want to tackle the concerns about how the state in the economy can distort the competition, how it can actually favor certain companies vis-a-vis others, you cannot just limit yourself to the narrow concept of subsidies. You need to look into a broader set of government actions. And that's why we thought that this concept of competitive neutrality, which has been developed in the OECD, but which is very generally accepted, which, by the way, China at some point in time has indicated that they are looking also into implications of the concept of competitive neutrality, that this broad concept of competitive neutrality can be an overall focus on which to try to develop disciplines that would need to look into subsidies, that would need to look into the role of state-owned enterprises, that would need to look into issues like forced technology transfer, that would need to look also into other non-transparent forms of intervention of the government in a manner which distorts competition in the economy. So from our point of view, this broad approach would be the one that would go to the root, that would tackle all three negative spillover effects that we have been discussing. But of course, it's difficult, and it raises quite a few questions. First, is there enough normative consensus to make it possible to imagine to negotiate rules on those matters? I would argue that we are not starting from zero. As I said, for instance, the concept of competitive neutrality has been developed in the OECD, and there are detailed recommendations by the OECD on principles reflecting the concept of competitive neutrality. And China has indicated that it is ready to talk about competitive neutrality. Actually, recently, China has even said that it is ready to talk about subsidies. So I think that we need to understand exactly what that means. If you look into issues relating to disciplines on subsidies, there were the ideas that were put forward by the Trilateral in January of 2020. They are not necessarily enough. I think we need to look into other issues. Quite frankly, I'm sure that we would need to discuss also what are the type of subsidies which should be considered more positively. We would need to discuss the concept of a green box on subsidies, which used to exist in the WTO, but which lasts. If you look into state-owned enterprises, you have disciplines that China has accepted, for instance, in its investment agreement with the European Union. If you look into forced technology transfer, you have disciplines that China has accepted both in its phase one agreement with the United States and in its investment agreement with the European Union. So there's quite a lot of elements there which suggest that there might be enough normative consensus to move forward. That doesn't mean, of course, that discussion would not be extremely difficult, and that some of the more difficult issues will be very hard to tackle. Perhaps more important than normative consensus is trust, because for such a negotiation to be able to function, you need to have enough trust that you can negotiate those issues meaningfully, particularly with China, and that you can actually come to an agreement on rules which can be properly monitored and enforced. And that, I think, is going to be perhaps the most difficult issue that you would need to tackle if you were going to decide to go in that direction. And of course, finally, the question how you can integrate such type of trilateral agreement within the framework of WTO rules, which again raises quite a significant number of complex issues. So very briefly, although we think that this would be the best perspective, certainly we will be quite interested to explore with others whether there is an interest to go in that direction. You may also need to look into options which are more limited. I mean, Simon, you referred to the need to look not only into sectors. Now, first point which I would totally agree, you need to look not only into industrial subsidies, you also need to look into agricultural subsidies. But when it comes to agricultural subsidies, there's already an agreement on agriculture, but it's going to be clear is how you can actually recreate the conditions to negotiate reductions on trade destructive domestic support, which we from the European Union, we are totally supportive that we need to move in that direction. But at this point in time, there's no discussion whatsoever in the WTO about doing something about industrial subsidies. And as Simon's paper very clearly illustrates, subsidies in the industrial sector are at least as important, if not more, as subsidies in the agricultural sector. Now, how can we start that conversation in Geneva? You can certainly talk about transparency, And transparency is a much more complicated issue than simply notifications. I think you need to see how you can generate a discussion about the policies underlying the subsidization. You need to look also into an effective system of counter notifications. So there's quite a few issues going around the concept of transparency that could be quite interesting to discuss in the Subsidies Committee of the WTO. And I was also quite intrigued by the indication of Simon. Why don't we actually look very focused on the whole question of climate neutrality? I mean, climate neutrality is clearly going to be the direction in which we all want to go. And if you actually look into subsidies, not only from the perspective of negative spillover effects on trade, but also positive or negative spillover effects on the global environment, I think then you entered, I think, into quite an interesting conversation. You may find some cases in which a certain type of subsidy is clearly negative, both from the trade and from an environmental perspective. You may actually have some cases of subsidies which can have clearly positive environmental effects, but potentially some negative trade effects. And you can have some cases which are clearly win-win type of subsidies. And having that kind of conversation, I think, would be quite an interesting one to have. Finally, of course, dispute settlement. I mean, I don't think I'm surprising anyone if I'm saying that if there's one issue which is fundamentally important for the European Union is to begin to seriously discuss in Geneva how to have again a fully functioning dispute settlement system in the WTO. The WTO without dispute settlement is not a rule-based trading system anymore. So I think finding a way forward to have a functioning dispute settlement system for us is fundamental, and we are encouraged that the United States is going to be ready to engage. And that discussion is going to include discussions about many issues. And perhaps one of the issues that also need to be discussed is this question about where, to some extent, some of the past jurisprudence on the WTO on trade remedies got things wrong. And there has to be ways in which that jurisprudence needs to be corrected, or in which the rules need to be further clarified. Now, it's a big debate. Obviously, there have been references to public body. There are other issues. But again, that's another issue that can be looked at. So you can be very ambitious. You can go for a plurilateral agreement on competitive neutrality. You have something which is more focused on looking into how to improve transparency and some aspects of subsidies disciplines. And there's also the angle about dispute settlement reform. And you need to see how you can combine these different elements. So I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you. That's a lot on the plate. I mean, we can't solve all that today, obviously, but we have an issue of increasing subsidies. And with the coming out of the economic crisis, the COVID crisis, but also many countries or most countries' ambitions to a carbon neutral economy, we will need to invest, and we will need subsidies. So there's an urgent need of some clearer definitions, what is good, what is bad. There is an urgent need for some disciplines and for clearer international rules. And obviously there are some that are existing, but they need updating. And we all know that negotiating in WTO is not easy, takes time, and WTO is struggling right now, finding ways forward in so many issues as well. We don't have much time yet, but time left. But Julia, Chad, Simon, do you want to respond or comment? Because Ignacio almost sketched an action plan there with proposals. Want to come in? Just wave, raise your hand, or unmute yourself quickly, Chad.
I have a question for Ignacio. Sorry to give you the hardest one, or one of the hard ones, Ignacio. But so I think the competitive neutrality proposal and idea is very attractive, except for when you get to the question of enforcement, right? And so you all in the Commission in Europe have managed that challenge by delegating the authority to this supranational power of Brussels. But how do you envision that in the case of the multilateral trading system in China, when arguably state-to-state dispute settlement, has already shown not to work, with challenges with China? There's, countries feel hesitant about bringing cases against China. Firms feel hesitant about being engaged in cases involving China because of, extra WTO retaliation. How would any of that be different? What kind of enforcement model do you have in mind with competitive neutrality?
No, you are absolutely right, Chad. That is the toughest question. And that's what I said, that probably the most difficult issue to go in that direction is trust, in terms that you can meaningfully negotiate rules with China, and a monitoring and enforcement mechanism that works in the context of a system which is highly non-transparent. So how can you actually make it work? First, to be very clear, I don't think that a competitive neutrality model would work, and if there was some political will from China to economic reform and to maintain some higher degree of autonomy for the state-owned sector. Now, if the direction in which the current Communist Party is going is clearly a direction of control of the economy, and there is no interest in going in the direction of economic reform, I don't think that what I had actually laid out is going to work. There is no reason, by the way, not to put it on the table and not to test the intentions of China. Secondly, I think you would need to trust but verify. I think you would need to have institutions which actually are in charge of monitoring how these disciplines are being applied also domestically. And by the way, China has for a long time indicated that they have concerns about the lack of knowledge, of control about what is happening at the provincial level. They have even been talking with our competition authorities to try to understand better what it is that we do. So I think that has to be part of it. But also, in a way, you need to have a dispute settlement system in which, when you actually have some evidence that there's an intervention by the state which is favoring some domestic enterprises, the burden of proof to demonstrate that there's a breach of the agreement should be very low. And therefore, in a way, you are shifting the burden of proof towards those who intervened in a non-transparent manner. But I think there's different elements that you would need to combine. Difficult to negotiate those rules. Skepticism about China's political willingness to go in that direction, fully understood. But no reason, I would say, at least, not to have the perspective and not to test it.
Julia, Simon, you want to comment on this? Julia, no? I think we have a long list of questions coming in. Some of you have already answered this. There's a question here on how do you mitigate free riding that might be a result of any plurilateral agreement on subsidies by like-minded partner? This is, of course, the eternal question when it comes to plurilateral, and it touches upon the enforcement as well.
Well, first, it's clear that this type of agreement makes no sense unless you have China on board. I mean, they are the biggest subsidizer, much more, by the way, than the US and the European Union, but I can discuss that with Simon in another occasion. But I said they are the biggest subsidizer. Now, ideally, you would have also some other emerging economies which are significant players in the subsidy field. So I think ideally it would be good to have a broader participation than OECD plus China. And I think there are some emerging economies that have indicated an interest to talk about this type of disciplines. But yes, there's potentially a certain issue of free riding, which is why this question about how to integrate these agreements into the WTO in a manner which somehow limits the scope of free riding is certainly one of the important questions that will have to be tackled. There are ways to do it, but it is not simple, I will agree.
There's one question on services. Simon, in your big mapping, you looked at goods, right? You didn't look at services, but they are, or were they also included? And how do you do with services? Is it the same approach?
So we did look at services, and we tried to document as much as we can. There's about 4,500 service sector subsidies that we found in the 3 jurisdictions. And so they're very much included. And I think people who followed the service sector and trade for a long period of time have often thought that this was a gap in the rules as well that needs to be filled in. So I would, if there was room to put that on the table, one should.
But they would need to be addressed separately, or can they be in the same big comprehensive approach as outlined? Well,
or I mean, maybe again, it depends what you're thinking about agreeing. At first, if we're thinking about what the principles are and a common understanding about what objectives and principles, maybe the service sector doesn't need to be treated differently. Again, when you get into the details, then if you were to go the rule-based route that Ignacio is talking about, then maybe it becomes separate.
Julia, did you want to intervene?
Not on service. Going back to the plurilateral versus multilateral, I do think as a practical matter, true, without China, maybe it doesn't make too much sense. However, I think we can take a page from these regional new trade agreement, like CPTPP, right? China has applied formally to join CPTPP, which actually has a chapter on state-owned enterprises, on the discipline, kind of implicitly also recognize that SOEs in the subsidy context, it could be, it's essentially public body. If you take that into the WTO agreement context, and that will be all the SOEs automatically become public body under the WTO agreement, which China has not so far not conceded yet. I mean, the US, it's a US versus China situation there. So the reason of mentioning that is it shows that CPTPP was not formed with China. China is a latecomer, right? Trying to apply, although probably can never join the way it goes now. However, it shows that if you have a plurilateral agreement, if the major other dominant, the players know what they want, they can clarify, agree among themselves, then you started to have this rulemaking, you have the norms. And it's possible that China will follow. And not necessarily at the very beginning. At the beginning, I think it will be extremely difficult to agree between China and others, considering the fundamental difference in what their goal is and the system. So I think if you have plurilateral, you know what you want, you create a new concept, a new framework, there's a chance China will follow.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. There are several questions. Some of them were directly related to your slides. Shad, maybe you can answer them bilaterally to these persons. And unfortunately, we have to wrap up. Thank you so much. I don't think we solved the issue, but at least I feel confused on a higher intellectual level, which is always something to be happy about. And we will definitely come back to this issue also at the broader concept of industrial policies. I know that the Industrial Policy Act is being prepared in the US, and the EU is doing several things here as well during the spring. So we'll come back to this. Thank you so much, Simon Evenett, Shad Bown, Julia Ya Qin, Ignacio Garcia Bercero, and all of you who watched. Thank you so much for joining us today. Goodbye.
Bye.